There are people who move through the world quietly, not lonely, not broken, just distant, as if life is something they observe more than participate in. They sit at the edges of gatherings, drift through hallways without leaving waves behind, and carry an inner life so rich, so private, that very few ever enter it. To others, they look like someone who has no friends. But behind that stillness is a story, one shaped by sensitivity, trust, memory, and the silent mathematics of how much a heart can hold. This is not a story about isolation. It is about the quiet psychology of people who learn to stand alone, and the invisible reasons that made solitude feel safer than company. Number 1. The quiet beginning. There is a particular silence that lives inside people who move through life without close friends. It isn't always painful. It's simply present, like background music that never turns off, even when everything else grows loud. For them, the world feels slightly out of reach, as if everyone else is speaking a language they were never fully taught. They understand the words, the gestures, the patterns of how people connect. But something inside remains one step removed, watching rather than participating. When others flow easily into conversations and companionship, they stand at the edges. Not because they don't care, but because something quiet within them chooses distance before they even realize it. This chapter begins where their solitude begins, not with an event, not with heartbreak, not with a dramatic turning point, but with a subtle, everyday feeling of being emotionally adjacent to life. They wake up in a world that is undeniably connected, buzzing phones, shared moments, the steady hum of friendships, yet they move through it with a soft detachment, as if their existence doesn't echo in the same way. Someone might see them on a bus, staring out the window, or at school, sitting alone during lunch, or at work, slipping in and out without leaving a trace. They don't appear troubled. Instead, there is a kind of calm, an inwardness that shields them from noise, expectation, and the unpredictable movements of other people's emotions. For many, this quiet beginning doesn't come from conscious choice. It is simply how life arranged itself. They grow used to silence. They grow used to their own company. They grow used to the fact that conversations feel heavier for them than for others. That small talk drains them. That social interactions feel scripted. That intimacy requires an emotional exposure they aren't sure they can give, so they build a life that works without depending on anyone. A life where they carry their own groceries, tell their own stories to themselves, sit with their thoughts as if those thoughts were companions. And in a way, they are. People often misunderstand them. Some think they are antisocial. Others assume they are lonely. But solitude is complicated. Sometimes it is protective. Sometimes it is peaceful. Sometimes it is simply the absence of a specific kind of bond, not a void, but an unoccupied space. The truth is that people who have no friends often feel things deeply. They notice subtleties others overlook, the hesitations in someone's voice, the way light moves across a room, the tension in conversations. Their emotional worlds are vivid, textured, and alive. But because their minds are often so full, their social lives become thinner. Not due to lack of desire, but because maintaining friendships requires a certain emotional bandwidth, and theirs is devoted elsewhere to thoughts, creativity, quiet reflections, or simply self-preservation. This chapter recognizes the emotional landscape before the story is explained. The soft ache, the calm acceptance, the small moments where they feel excluded without ever being pushed away, the nights when they realize no one is checking on them, and the strange mix of freedom and emptiness that follows. People like this often grow skilled at appearing fine. They laugh when needed. They participate when expected. They adapt to the social fabric like someone who knows the steps of a dance but doesn't feel the rhythm. Inside, however, there is a constant sense of watching themselves from a short distance, as if the world is happening around them. And they are only a quiet witness. The beginning of their story is not dramatic, but it is deeply human. It is the experience of someone who learned early on that life can be lived without orbiting around others. Someone who discovered that silence can be both comforting and isolating. Someone who exists on the edge of connection. Not by design, but by temperament, by experience, or simply by the invisible shape of their heart. This is the quiet beginning, the recognition of what it feels like to walk through life without the anchor of friendships, long before the reasons become clear. Number 2. Where the distance began. Distance doesn't appear all at once. It forms quietly, almost invisibly, in the earliest rooms of a person's life. Before they ever understood the meaning of friendship. Before they knew what connection was supposed to feel like. Long before they grew into someone others describe as having no friends. Begins in moments so small they barely register, moments that echo louder as the years pass. For some, the distance begins in childhood homes where emotions were not safely spoken. They might have grown up with parents who loved them but didn't quite understand them, or who were too overwhelmed to sit with a sensitive child's inner world. In those rooms, feelings were kept tidy. Questions were left unanswered. Vulnerability was something that happened quietly behind closed doors. And little by little, child learned that the safest place to feel was alone. Others learned distance through unpredictability. Maybe love was conditional. Maybe affection came and went. Maybe they were scolded for expressing too much or ignored when they expressed too little. In such environments, the heart adapts. It folds inward. It protects itself. It becomes cautious with closeness, careful with trust, and observant in ways that make social connection feel more like a risk than a relief. Some children were simply different. Introverted in a world that rewards loudness. They were the ones who played quietly, who preferred imagination over groups, who felt overwhelmed by loud tables or chaotic classrooms. While other children bonded effortlessly, they needed more time, more calm, more space. But life moved fast. Social circles formed quickly, and the quieter child drifted to the background, unnoticed in ways that felt natural at the time, yet meaningful in hindsight. Then there are those who discover distance through disappointment. A friend who left without explanation. A betrayal that stung deeper than anyone realized. A moment of exclusion that carved a memory sharper than it should have. These encounters teach the heart a lasting lesson. Closeness can hurt, and solitude never betrays you. Sometimes the distance forms not through pain, but through observation. Children watch everything: the way adults argue, the way siblings compete, the way friendships fall apart. If they grow up seeing connection as unstable or exhausting, they instinctively choose steadiness over involvement. They retreat, not out of fear, but out of wisdom shaped too early. Temperament shapes distance too. Some people are born with nervous systems that absorb too much noise, too much emotion, too much social energy. Their inner world becomes their refuge. Friends, even kind ones, require a level of effort their bodies struggle to sustain. So they build careful, quiet routines that keep them balanced. Routines that leave little room for deep friendships. And then there is the role of belonging, or the absence of it. A child who never feels fully understood learns to self-contain. A teenager who doesn't fit into groups learns to camouflage. A young adult who feels too much or too little learns to stay on the edges. These patterns don't vanish with age. They soften into habits, and those habits eventually become a personality that others mistake for indifference. The origins of distance are rarely dramatic. They are found in moments like a child keeping a secret because no one asked, a teenager eating alone because joining others felt like an intrusion, A student pretending to prefer solitude because inclusion felt uncertain. A young adult declining invitations because their social energy never is quite recovered from earlier years by the time they reach adulthood. The distance feels natural, automatic, effortless. People admire their independence without knowing it was shaped by necessity, not preference. The individual themselves may not even recognize when the pattern began. They only know that closeness feels heavy, that trust feels delicate, and that solitude feels like the path of least resistance, familiar, predictable, safe. This chapter is the excavation of those beginnings. The early lessons, the small wounds, the natural temperament, the unspoken memories, the quiet shaping of someone who learned, long before they had words for it, that life felt easier when lived from a gentle distance. Number 3. The psychology of withdrawal. There comes a point where distance is no longer just a memory or a habit. It becomes a psychological pattern, one that shapes how a person thinks, feels, and responds to the world. To understand why some people live without close friends, it helps to look at what happens inside the mind and body when connection feels complicated. Withdrawal is not usually a conscious decision. It is a response, a quiet recalibration of the nervous system. Some individuals are wired with heightened sensitivity. Their brains process social cues more intensely. A simple conversation feels like absorbing layers of tone, expression, subtext, and emotional energy all at once, while others glide through interactions effortlessly. These individuals walk away mentally tired, drained by the invisible labor of tracking every detail. Their bodies seek recovery in solitude, and over time, that solitude becomes their default state. Psychology names this social overstimulation. For people with finely tuned nervous systems, socializing is not unpleasant, just expensive. Each interaction carries a cost, and when the cost outweighs the reward, withdrawal becomes a natural form of preservation. Another layer comes from attachment styles. People who grow up with inconsistent emotional experiences often develop avoidant or anxious patterns. An avoidant pattern teaches the mind that closeness is risky, that relying on others invites pain or disappointment. An anxious pattern teaches the mind that relationships require constant effort and self-monitoring, which can be exhausting. So, the safest path becomes minimal attachment. Minimal vulnerability. Minimal exposure, it isn't that they don't want friends. It's that connection demands emotional resources their heart learned to ration. Then there is rejection sensitivity. Some individuals carry deep neural imprints from earlier disappointments. Their brains anticipate exclusion long before it happens. A neutral text feels cold. A delayed reply feels personal. A small shift in tone triggers a storm of self-doubt. These misread signals create a cycle. Withdrawal protects them from perceived rejection. Isolation reinforces their belief that they were right to withdraw. This loop strengthens over time, carving deeper patterns into the mind. Cognitive habits also play a role. People who have spent years in solitude develop inner dialogues that prioritize self-reliance. The brain becomes skilled at soothing itself, entertaining itself, comforting itself. Overthinking becomes a companion, reflection becomes a reflex, and inner life becomes more vivid than the outer world. When the mind becomes its own ecosystem, friendships feel optional, not unnecessary, but not urgent either. Another psychological factor is emotional. Minimalism, the tendency to conserve emotional energy by limiting interpersonal involvement. Individuals who practice emotional minimalism aren't cold. They simply have a strong internal boundary system. Their emotional world is private, carefully curated, and not easily shared. Opening up feels like handing someone a fragile object. They fear the other person won't know how to hold. Introversion also carries weight here. Not the casual kind people joke about, but deep introversion. the kind where solitude isn't just enjoyable, but necessary. Introverts often build slow, thoughtful connections that require time and emotional safety. When life circumstances don't offer those conditions, they drift into independence by default. There is also a more complex psychological phenomenon. Some individuals experience identity diffusion in groups. They feel like they blend too easily, lose sense of themselves, or become who others need them to be. To protect their internal stability, they choose solitude, where the self remains intact. And finally, the most human reason people withdraw because it feels easier. Social bonds require maintenance, checking in, keeping up, being emotionally available. For someone who has learned to carry everything alone, these tasks feel heavy, even unnatural. Their minds are shaped for introspection, not for constant interaction. So the psychology of withdrawal is not coldness, not indifference, not dysfunction. It is a nuanced web of temperament, nervous system sensitivity, attachment history, emotional energy, self-protection, and quiet habit, all forming the inner logic of someone who lives life with few or no friends. This chapter is the scientific lens that reveals the depth behind solitude. Not a flaw, not a failure, but a psychological landscape shaped over years, one quiet adaptation at a time. Number 4. The inner conflict. Inside every person who lives without close friendships, there is a quiet contradiction, a soft, persistent tension between wanting closeness and wanting safety. It is not dramatic. It is not loud. It is not something they speak about. It simply exists beneath the calm exterior, like a gentle current moving under still water. This is the inner conflict, the heart's desire for connection versus the mind's instinct for protection. People who have no friends often carry a sensitive, finely tuned emotional compass. They notice when someone's tone shifts. They sense when they're being misunderstood. They feel when conversations become shallow or when expectations become heavy. These sensitivities make relationships more complex than they appear. What looks simple to others feels layered and demanding to them, so they step back. Not because they don't care, but because caring too much has its cost. One part of them longs for someone who gets them effortlessly. Someone with whom silence feels comfortable and presence feels light. This longing is gentle, but real. It shows up in small ways, a moment of unexpected loneliness, a sudden ache while watching others laugh together, a quiet wish that someone might notice their absence. But the other part, the protective part, remembers the burn of trust. It remembers the times they opened up and felt exposed, the moments when connection turned into confusion, the friendships that drifted, the times they became too available, too sensitive, or too different for the people they try to keep. These memories linger, shaping a cautious heart. Their inner world becomes a negotiation. Is it worth trying? Will they understand me? What if I disappear again and no one notices? What if I give too much? What if I give too little? This constant evaluation doesn't mean they reject people. It means they move through relationships with quiet calculations, balancing emotional risk against emotional capacity. This makes connection feel heavier than it should, not because the other person demands too much, but because their own mind is busy navigating invisible emotional terrain. And yet, there is another layer, self-perception. People who are used to being alone often begin seeing themselves through a distorted lens. They may feel too boring, too complicated, too quiet, or too behind to fit into the social worlds of others. These beliefs, whether true or not, create a subtle self-exclusion. They decline invitations not because they don't want company, but because they preemptively assume they won't fit the space they're entering. This creates a cycle. They withdraw to protect themselves. The withdrawal creates isolation, The isolation reinforces the belief that they are better off alone, even when someone tries to get close. The internal resistance appears a quiet pullback, a hesitance to share too much, a sudden need for space. They fear being misunderstood more than they fear being alone. They fear disappointing others more than they fear disconnecting. And yet, they still feel the sting of loneliness in unexpected moments. A late-night thought, an empty phone, a memory of someone they once trusted, a realization that life is passing quietly. Without witnesses, this conflict, craving connection but fearing its weight, shapes much of their behavior. They do not reject relationships. They simply struggle to hold them without losing themselves. They love deeply but silently. They miss people they never fully let in. They feel safer alone but not always content there. The world sees someone distant. Inside, there is someone quietly torn. This chapter reveals that their solitude is not indifference, but tension. Not avoidance, but protection. Not coldness, but complexity. A heart that wants closeness, yet whispers, "Be careful." A human contradiction. Longing and retreat. Hope and hesitation. Softness wrapped in armor. The inner conflict is not a flaw. It is the quiet psychology of a person who has learned that connection is beautiful and fragile. Number 5. When something finally breaks. There is a moment, sometimes sudden, sometimes slow, when solitude stops feeling neutral and begins to feel heavier than it used to. Not unbearable, not urgent, just heavier, like a quiet shift in the air. People who live without friends often reach a point where something inside them stirs. A soft realization that the distance they built for protection has grown into something larger than they intended. It doesn't happen dramatically. There is no collapse, no breaking point others can see. Instead, it begins with small recognitions. Maybe it appears one evening when the world feels unusually quiet, and they notice how long it has been since someone asked a genuine question. Maybe it rises during an ordinary moment, sitting in a cafe, watching a conversation at the next table, feeling something inside them tighten with an ache they didn't expect. Or maybe it comes while scrolling through contacts and realizing there is no one they would call. Not because they don't care, but because the connection never grew roots. These moments are subtle, but they carry weight. It's the realization that independence has become isolation, that privacy has become invisibility, that emotional safety has become emotional distance. Nothing breaks loudly. It breaks softly, like a thread loosening. Sometimes the turning point comes through loss, the end of a job, the departure of someone familiar, a life transition that leaves them with empty space they don't know how to fill. In these transitions, the absence of friends becomes more noticeable. They feel the hollow edges of silence more distinctly, not because they suddenly crave a crowd, but because they recognize the human need for someone who witnesses their life. For others, the shift arrives through self-reflection. They notice a growing desire to be understood, to be known beyond the surface, to feel the quiet comfort of companionship. It is not loneliness they feel. It is the awareness that living entirely inside one's own mind can become its own kind of burden. The heart begins to ask questions. The mind can no longer quiet. Is this really enough? Am I missing something I didn't allow myself to want? When did solitude become easier than connection? And why does it now feel different? This is not a plea for friendship. It is a moment of clarity. Sometimes the turning point comes from observing others, seeing someone share a small vulnerability and witnessing the warmth it creates. Or watching friendships endure conflict and understanding that connection doesn't always have to be overwhelming or fragile. These observations plant a quiet curiosity. Maybe closeness doesn't have to be painful. Maybe presence doesn't have to demand so much, and occasionally, the realization appears through a simple, human moment, wanting someone to share a thought with, wanting someone to sit beside them without expectations, wanting a presence that isn't heavy, isn't draining, isn't complicated, just real. This shift doesn't erase the fears that built the distance. It simply reveals what the distance has cost. It highlights the birthdays spent alone, the victories unshared, the emotional storms weathered silently, the unspoken longing to be seen in small, meaningful ways. Something breaks, not in the sense of collapse, but in the sense of awakening. A protective layer that once felt necessary begins to feel restrictive. A silence that once brought peace begins to feel too deep. A wall that once ensured safety now feels like it keeps the world too far away. This chapter is about that quiet threshold, the moment when a person who has lived in solitude begins to wonder whether there is another way to exist. It is not a promise of change. It is not the beginning of transformation. It is simply the first flicker of awareness, a soft realization that even the strongest self-reliance carries shadows, a gentle understanding that connection doesn't need to overwhelm, it only needs space. This is the turning point, a moment when something inside whispers, maybe it's time to open the door, even just a little.